How did they do this?
Hi, Emily. Yeah, it comes all the way down to smartphones, right? There's been all this talk about the smartphone business dying or going away, and that might be because of the higher prices that we're seeing from Apple and Samsung in recent years. But Xiaomi has sort of taken another approach. They've said, I think we could sell a ton of phones if we price them to what they cost to build. That means we're not really passing on many costs to consumers. We're going to look at this as a services business where we sell things at cost, maybe take some losses along the way, but long term set ourselves up for success.
So what does this mean for Apple? Of course, this is a company with a very different strategy. You know, Xiaomi is beating them in places like India, for example, as you've reported. But does a stronger Xiaomi mean a threat to Apple?
Right now in the U.S., there's really not much of a threat. I mean, I still think Apple's biggest threat in the U.S. is Samsung, perhaps Google if they get their act together on their phones longer term. But internationally, Xiaomi is a real player. If you look at the statistics and the market share metrics in China and India and Japan and Korea and basically anywhere outside of the United States, Samsung and Apple have some serious competition from the likes of Xiaomi, Oppo, and Huawei, and it is a clear threat to Apple. I think it's a bigger threat than most people thought it would be just a couple of years ago.
So, you know, what else does Xiaomi have to prove here? I mean, there's a reason that the IPO was lackluster. There are still questions about whether they can turn themselves into this services company that they have promised to become.
Right. I mean, the big question is still the runway of the smartphones. They seem to have figured out their own niche in the smartphone market where the high end is so dominated by Samsung, Apple, and Google. So it's to be seen how long that lasts. They're eventually going to have to pivot that into a services business if they get enough phones out into the marketplace. And another thing to take a look at is if you look deep at the numbers, sure, they reported a profit, but in reality, it's about a $1 billion operating loss. And the reason it came out as a profit is because of how they adjusted some of their existing stock holdings. And we have a story on the terminal that explains that. But overall, much better than what would have been expected while looking at the original IPO situation from a few weeks ago.
So put this into context of the phones we're expecting Apple to unveil later this year, what Samsung has already unveiled. How do you expect the next year in smartphone sales to play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Xiaomi is not going to do much innovative on the high end, but I think they're going to continue to dominate India, parts of developing regions in Europe, in China, and elsewhere on the Eastern Hemisphere. But I think Apple is going to have a really compelling offering with their 3 new phones this fall. They have their own cheaper iPhone model that's going to start around $700. Still, that's going to be about $500 more than some of these mid-tier Xiaomi phones. So they're playing in 2 totally different playing fields. One that's primarily focused on the high end and one that's on the low end.